You know those moments when life hits you like a freight train disguised as an ordinary Tuesday? Mine came when I was standing in my Napa Valley kitchen, holding my 20-year-old wedding dress and wondering why I'd kept it hanging in my closet, like some ghost of a woman I used to be. The ivory silk felt foreign in my hands, like it belonged to someone else entirely. Maybe it did. Maybe the Rachel who wore this dress died somewhere between learning to smile through charity galas and perfecting the art of being seen but never truly known. That's when the doorbell rang, and everything changed. Not in the dramatic, movie scene way you might expect, but in the quiet, real way that actually matters. Standing on my doorstep was a man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, holding a toolbox and looking slightly confused by the wedding dress draped over my arm like some surrendered flag. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Rachel Henderson, though for 20 years it was. Rachel Castellano, wife of Richard Castellano, owner of 3 upscale restaurants in the Bay Area. At 50, I was supposed to have it all figured out. The perfect house with its rolling vineyard views, the successful husband, the grown daughter, making her own way in the world. Instead, I was standing in my kitchen at 2 p.m. on a Wednesday, holding the remnants of a marriage that had crumbled 3 months earlier, when I discovered my husband's idea of fine dining included a 28-year-old sommelier named Sophia on the side. The divorce papers were signed, the settlements divided, and Richard had moved into his downtown San Francisco loft with his new life and his new love. What remained was me, this house that felt too big and too quiet, and a wine cellar filled with bottles I'd never chosen and didn't particularly want to drink. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was surrounded by thousands of dollars worth of aged wine while feeling like my own life had gone completely flat. "Mrs. Henderson," the repair technician asked, his voice gentle and professional. "It's just Rachel." "Now," I replied, dropping the wedding dress onto the marble countertop with more force than necessary. "And you must be here about my wine cellar catastrophe." His name was Ben Martinez, and there was something immediately comforting about his presence. Not in a romantic way, not at first, but in the way that some people just seem steady, like they've learned to find their balance in an unsteady world. As I led him through the house toward the basement stairs, I found myself talking, which was strange because I'd barely spoken to another adult in weeks, except for necessary conversations about legal documents and utility transfers. "The house feels different when you're the only one in it," I heard myself saying. "Bigger, more echoey, like it's waiting for something to happen, but nothing ever does." Ben nodded as if this made perfect sense, which somehow made me feel less foolish for saying it. The basement of our house, my house now, had been Richard's pride and joy. Temperature-controlled wine storage for over 300 bottles, custom oak racks, proper humidity controls, the works. It was the kind of setup that wine enthusiasts dream about, and it had cost more than most people's cars. Yesterday morning, the temperature control system had simply died, taking with it the careful climate that kept Richard's precious collection at exactly 55 degrees. 20 years of his Bordeaux collection, I explained, gesturing at the rows of bottles that represented more money than I wanted to calculate. "Most of it's going to spoil if we can't get the temperature back down." I paused, looking at the wine that I'd never really understood or appreciated, feeling suddenly overwhelmed by the responsibility of preserving something that felt like it belonged to a different life entirely. That's when I said something I absolutely didn't plan to say, something that surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise him. "I'm 50, you know. This might be my last chance at love, and I'm spending it trying to save wine I don't even drink." The words hung in the air between us, and I immediately felt my cheeks flush with embarrassment. "Sorry," I added quickly. "I don't usually overshare with repair technicians. It's just been a strange few months." Ben set down his toolbox and looked at me with genuine curiosity, rather than the polite discomfort I expected. "Last chance at love?" he asked, and there was no judgment in his voice, just honest interest. "Why would you think that?" I laughed, but it came out shaky and uncertain. "Because I'm 50 and newly divorced, and I have no idea who I am when I'm not, being someone's wife. Because dating at 50 feels like trying to learn a foreign language when everyone else learned it in high school. Because I look in the mirror and see my mother's face looking back, and while she was a wonderful woman, she's not exactly who I pictured myself becoming." Ben was quiet for a moment, examining the temperature control panel with practiced efficiency. "50's not old," he said finally. "My sister just got married last year. She's 52. And she says it's the first time in her life she's felt like herself in a relationship. Maybe it's not about last chances. Maybe it's about first chances at getting it right." It was such a simple observation, but it hit me like a revelation. I'd been thinking about my divorce as an ending, as evidence that I'd failed at the most important thing I was supposed to do as a woman. But what if it wasn't an ending at all? What if it was just clearing away something that wasn't, working to make room for something that might? While Ben worked on diagnosing the cooling system, I found myself telling him things I hadn't admitted to anyone, maybe not even to myself. About how Richard and I had met when I was 28, fresh out of graduate school with a photography degree and dreams of traveling the world documenting stories that mattered. About how he'd been charming and successful and so confident about what our life together would look like that I'd gradually stopped imagining alternatives. "What happened to the photography?" Ben asked, not looking up from the tangle of wires he was examining. I shrugged, though he couldn't see it. Life happened. Richard's restaurants took off, and I became the wife who hosted dinner parties and looked good at charity events and knew how to make conversation with food critics and investors. There wasn't time for traveling around taking pictures, and honestly, after a while I stopped missing it. You can convince yourself you don't want something if you practice long enough. But you did want it once, Ben said. It wasn't really a question. I did, I admitted. I wanted it so much it hurt sometimes. But wanting something and being practical about your life are two different things. At least, that's what I told myself for 20 years. The cooling system, it turned out, had multiple problems. The compressor was struggling, the thermostat had failed, and there was an electrical issue that would require several hours to properly diagnose and repair. "This isn't going to be a quick fix," Ben explained, and I could tell he was trying to prepare me for bad news about both timeline and cost. "That's okay," I said, surprising myself with how calm I felt about it. "It's not like, I have anywhere else to be. Do you want some coffee? Or I could make lunch?" I realize that sounds strange, but this is the most interesting conversation I've had in months, and I'm not ready for it to end just yet. Ben smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Coffee sounds great," he said, "but only if you tell me more about the photography. What kind of pictures did you take?" So we went back upstairs to my kitchen, and I made coffee in the ridiculously expensive espresso machine that Richard had insisted we needed, and I told Ben about the portraits I used to take. Street photography in San Francisco, landscapes during, weekend trips to Big Sur, but mostly people. I loved photographing people, especially older people whose faces told stories of lives fully lived. "There's something beautiful about age," I explained, "about faces that show experience and wisdom, and the weight of having loved and lost, and kept going anyway." "You should start again," Ben said, and I laughed because it seemed so impossible. At 50, after 20 years, I wouldn't even know where to begin. Besides, the digital camera world has completely changed since I last did anything serious. Ben shrugged. "So you learn the new technology. People don't stop having stories just because you took a break from telling them? And 50's not old, remember? You could have another whole career ahead of you if you wanted it." We talked for 2 hours while the wine cellar slowly warmed and the expensive bottles gradually moved closer to spoiling. I learned that Ben was 47, divorced for 5 years, with 2 teenage sons who lived with their mother in Sacramento. He'd originally gone to school for environmental engineering, but had taken over his father's HVAC business when his dad had a heart attack, 10 years earlier. He still thought about going back to his original career sometimes, but it seemed impractical now, too late to start over. "It's never too late to start over," I said, echoing his earlier words back to him. He laughed and nodded. "Touché. Maybe we're both making excuses." "Maybe we are," I agreed. When Ben finally went back downstairs to continue working on the cooling system, I stayed in the kitchen, thinking about our conversation and feeling something I hadn't experienced in months, genuine interest in my own future. For the first time since Richard left, I wasn't just surviving the days or marking time until things felt normal again. I was actually curious about what might come next. The afternoon light was slanting through my kitchen windows, casting everything in that golden glow that photographers call magic hour, and I found myself wishing I had a camera to capture it. Not just any camera, but a real camera. The kind I used to carry everywhere when I thought my eye for beauty might actually matter to the world. Ben emerged from the basement a few hours later, wiping his hands on a rag and looking cautiously optimistic. "Good news and bad news," he announced. "The good news is I can fix it. The bad news is I need to order a part, so it'll be at least 2 more days before your wine is safe." 2 more days, I repeated, and I wasn't thinking about the wine at all. "I should be able to get the part by Friday," Ben continued. "Would morning work for you?" "Friday morning would be perfect," I said. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "And Ben? Thank you. Not just for fixing the cooling system, but for listening. It's been a while since anyone asked me what I actually wanted from my life." Ben packed up his tools and headed toward the front door, then paused. "Rachel?" he said, and there was something different in his voice. A little less professional and a little more personal. "I hope you think about the photography thing. The world needs people who know how to see beauty, especially in places where other people might miss it." After he left, I wandered back down to the wine cellar and looked at the hundreds of bottles Richard had collected over the years. Vintages from France and Italy and California, each one chosen for its potential to improve with age, to become something special and valuable given enough time and the right conditions. I'd never thought of myself as someone who needed aging or special conditions to become worthwhile, but maybe I'd been wrong about that too. Maybe 50 wasn't too late to discover what I might become if I gave myself the chance to grow into who I was always meant to be. The wine could wait a couple more days. I was starting to think that some things, the important things, were worth the time it took to get them right. Friday morning arrived gray and drizzly, the kind of northern, California weather that makes even the most beautiful vineyard look moody and introspective. I'd woken up earlier than usual, which had become my pattern since the divorce. Sleep seemed less necessary when your days weren't anchored by someone else's schedule, someone else's needs. I made myself a proper breakfast for once, scrambled. Eggs with herbs from the garden I'd been neglecting, and found myself looking forward to Ben's return in a way that felt both exciting and terrifying. I'd spent the past 2 days thinking about our conversation, turning over his suggestion about photography like a stone I'd found on the beach, smooth and interesting but not quite ready to be pocketed. Thursday evening, I'd actually gone up to the attic and pulled down the old boxes I'd stored there years ago. Boxes I'd convinced myself contained nothing but dust and outdated equipment. But when I opened them, I found my old Nikon cameras, my lenses carefully wrapped in tissue paper, contact sheets from photo shoots I'd forgotten I'd done, and dozens of prints that made me remember why I'd fallen in love with capturing moments in the first place. There was a series I'd done of elderly couples in Golden Gate Park, their faces telling stories of decades together, hands that found each other automatically, smiles that suggested shared jokes and weathered storms. Another set showed street. Musicians in North Beach, their faces intense with concentration, lost in their music while the world rushed past them. Looking at these images again, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pride in work that was mine. Something I'd created that had nothing to do with supporting someone else's dreams or making someone else look good. When Ben arrived, he looked more rested than he had on Wednesday. And he was carrying not just his toolbox, but a small cooler and what appeared to be a bakery bag. "Thought you might want lunch later," he explained when he saw me looking. "My ex-wife always said I was terrible at remembering to eat when I was working on a complicated repair. Figured you might have the same problem." It was such a thoughtful gesture, so unexpectedly considerate, that I felt something tighten in my chest. When was the last time someone had anticipated my needs without being asked? Richard had been generous in his way, but it was always the kind of generosity that came with expectations, gifts that were really investments in the image he wanted us to project. This felt different, simpler, more genuine. Ben went straight to work on the cooling system, and I found myself hovering nearby, not wanting to interfere but reluctant to leave. There was something soothing about watching someone who knew exactly what they were doing, whose hands moved with confidence and precision. He explained what he was doing as he worked, not in a condescending way, but as if he genuinely thought I might be interested in understanding how the system functioned. The compressor had failed completely, he told me, which meant the whole unit would need to be rebuilt with new components. It's actually a fairly old system, probably installed when the house was built. You might want to consider upgrading to something more energy efficient while we're at it. I nodded, though the decision felt overwhelming in the way that all decisions had felt since the divorce. Every choice, no matter how small, seemed to carry the weight of defining who I was going to be now that I was solely responsible for my own life. While Ben worked, I wandered around the basement, really looking at it for the first time in years. Richard had claimed this space so completely that I'd stopped thinking of it as part of the house I lived in. But now, with him gone and the wine collection feeling more like an obligation than a treasure, I could see the space differently. The basement was actually quite large, with good natural light from several windows and solid concrete floors that could support heavy equipment. It had been finished beautifully, with exposed brick walls and rustic wooden beams that gave it character. Behind the wine racks, tucked into a corner I'd never really examined closely, I noticed something that didn't belong. A wooden crate, old and dusty, wedged between the wall and the back of the storage system. "Ben," I called out, "can you help me move this rack? I think there's something behind it." Together, we shifted the heavy wine storage unit just enough for me to squeeze behind it and pull out the crate. It was heavier than I'd expected, and when I opened it, I gasped. Inside were dozens of my old photography portfolios, carefully wrapped in plastic and stored with the kind of care you take with things you can't bear to throw away but can't quite bear to look at either. "I must have put these down here years ago and forgotten about them," I said, pulling out portfolio after portfolio. The plastic had protected them from moisture, and the cool temperature had preserved them beautifully. As I opened the first one, a collection of black and white portraits I'd taken during graduate school, I felt like I was meeting an old friend I'd lost touch with decades ago. "These are incredible," Ben said, looking over my shoulder at a portrait I'd taken of an elderly man feeding pigeons in Washington Square Park. The composition was strong, the lighting dramatic, and the subject's face told a story of loneliness and connection that still moved me 20 years later. "You really do have a gift for this." I felt tears prick at my eyes, though I couldn't say exactly why. Maybe it was seeing evidence of the person I used to be. The person who believed her vision mattered enough to carry a camera everywhere and look for moments worth preserving. Maybe it was the realization of how completely I'd abandoned something that had once been so central to my identity. Or maybe it was simply the kindness in Ben's voice, The way he looked at my work with genuine appreciation, rather than the polite interest Richard had always shown when forced to acknowledge my artistic pursuits. We spread the portfolios out on a workbench Ben had set up, and I found myself telling him about each series, remembering not just when and where I'd taken the photographs, but how I'd felt while I was taking them. There was a project I'd done, documenting small family businesses in Chinatown. Another that followed a group of senior citizens who met every morning for Tai Chi in the park. I'd been drawn to stories about community, about the ways people connected with each other across generations and cultural differences. "Why did you stop?" Ben asked gently. It wasn't an accusation, just genuine curiosity about how someone could walk away from work that was clearly so important to them. "I don't know if I can explain it in a way that makes sense," I said slowly. "When Richard and I got married, his career was taking off so quickly. The restaurants were doing well, and there were always investors to meet, events to attend, people to impress. My photography felt selfish in comparison, like an expensive hobby rather than something that contributed to our life together. And Richard never said I had to stop, but he made it clear that my time would be better spent supporting his work. Building our future together, he called it." Ben nodded thoughtfully. "But it wasn't really together, was it? It was his future. And you were just along for the ride." "Exactly," I said, and the word came out with more force than I'd intended. I became an accessory to his success instead of creating my own. And after a while, it was easier to stop missing photography than to keep feeling like I was neglecting the life I was supposed to want. We worked side by side for the rest of the morning, Ben repairing the cooling system while I organized my old portfolios and tried to process the flood of memories they'd unleashed. Around noon, he declared the repair complete and invited me to test the new system. The temperature had already dropped several degrees, and the gentle hum of the compressor was steady and reassuring. "Your wine is safe," Ben announced with a smile. "Though I have to ask, do you actually want all this wine? Because if you're not planning to drink it, you could sell it and probably make enough money to fund a pretty serious photography studio." The idea hit me like lightning. I'd been so focused on preserving Richard's collection because it felt like the responsible thing to do, but Ben was right. These bottles were worth a small fortune, and they represented nothing but memories of a life that no longer fit me. Why should I spend money maintaining a collection I didn't want, when I could use that money to rebuild something I'd lost? "You're brilliant," I said, feeling an excitement I hadn't experienced in years. I could convert this whole space into a dark room and studio. The basement has everything I'd need: space, privacy, good ventilation, and now proper climate control for storing equipment and prints. Ben's eyes lit up. "Now that's an idea worth pursuing. You could keep some of the wine storage for the really good bottles, the ones you might actually want to drink someday, and use the rest of the space for photography. Best of both worlds." We spent the lunch break Ben had packed eating sandwiches and sketching out ideas for how the basement could be reconfigured. He had a practical engineer's mind for solving spatial problems, and I found myself getting more excited with each suggestion he made. We could put the enlargers here, the developing trays there, storage for chemicals and paper along this wall. There was even space for a small office area where I could meet with clients or work on digital editing. "Clients," I repeated, testing the word. It felt foreign but thrilling to imagine having clients again, people who would hire me to capture something important to them. "You could start small," Ben suggested. "Maybe offer portrait sessions for families, or document local businesses the way you used to do in Chinatown. Napa Valley has such a rich community of artists and farmers and winemakers. There are probably hundreds of stories waiting to be told." As the afternoon wore on, I realized I was more energized than I'd been in months. The depression that had settled over me like fog since the divorce was lifting, replaced by something that felt like possibility. Ben finished his work on the tea cooling system and began packing up his tools, but I found myself reluctant to see him go. "Ben," I said as he headed toward the stairs, Would you like to stay for dinner? I know it's probably not professional, but I'd love to cook for someone who doesn't expect restaurant-quality food. Plus, I opened a bottle of wine to celebrate the working cooling system, and it seems wrong to drink it alone. He paused, considering. Are you sure? I don't want to overstep any boundaries here. You're not overstepping, I assured him. If anything, you've helped me remember that I'm allowed to want things again. That feels worth celebrating. So Ben stayed for dinner, and I cooked a simple meal of pasta with vegetables from my garden. Food that tasted better because it was shared with someone who appreciated the effort behind it. We opened a bottle of Pinot Noir from Richard's collection, and I discovered that wine could actually be enjoyable when you weren't drinking it to impress anyone or prove anything about your sophistication. Tell me about your sons, I said as we settled on the patio with our wine, watching the sun set over the vineyard that came with the property. Ben's face softened when he talked about his boys, 17 and 15, both athletes who were navigating the complicated terrain of adolescence with their father living 2 hours away. They're good kids, he said. Smarter than I was at their age, and more focused. Sometimes I worry that the divorce messed them up more than their mother and I realized. But they seem to be doing okay. Better than okay, actually. Do you miss them? I asked. Every day, Ben admitted. But I also think the distance has made me a better father in some ways. When we're together, it's intentional. We're not just going through the motions of family life. We're actually present with each other. I thought about my daughter Jessica, 25 and living in Portland, working for a nonprofit that provided legal services to immigrants. We talked regularly, but our conversations had become routine, dutiful, rather than connected. Since the divorce, she'd been checking on me with the careful concern of someone managing a fragile relative, and I'd been trying to prove I was fine even when I wasn't sure that was true. Maybe that's what I need to learn, I said. How to be intentional about the relationships that matter instead of just maintaining them out of habit. It's harder than it sounds, Ben said with a rueful smile. But it's also more rewarding. When you stop taking people for granted, you start noticing things about them you might have missed before. As the evening wore on, our conversation drifted from family to dreams to the small disappointments and unexpected joys that make up most of adult life. Ben told me about his desire to go back to school for environmental engineering, something he'd been thinking about for years but had never quite found the courage to pursue. I shared my growing certainty that I wanted to return to photography, not as a hobby but as a serious pursuit that could become a new career. It's scary, starting over at our age, I admitted. Everyone expects you to have figured everything out by 50, to be settled and secure and confident about the choices you've made. But maybe that's exactly when you're old enough to stop caring. What everyone expects, Ben said. Maybe 50 is when you finally get to choose your life instead of just accepting the one that happened to you. When Ben finally left that evening, I walked him to his truck and stood in my driveway longer than necessary, reluctant to go back inside to a house that would feel too quiet after an evening of real conversation. Thank you, I said, and I meant it for so much more than the wine cellar repair. Thank you for reminding me that I used to be interesting, I continued, that I used to have opinions and dreams and projects that mattered to me. I'd forgotten that version of myself existed. She didn't go anywhere, Ben said gently. She was just waiting for the right moment to come back. Part 3. Small Steps Forward. The weekend passed in a strange suspended state between my old life and whatever was coming next. Saturday morning, I called a wine appraiser I found online and scheduled an appointment for the following week. If I was going to sell most of Richard's collection, I wanted to do it properly, to get fair value for bottles that could fund my transition back to photography. The idea of turning his obsession into my opportunity felt like a kind of poetic justice. I also spent hours in the basement, measuring spaces and making lists of equipment I'd need to set up a proper darkroom and studio. The internet had transformed photography in the 20 years since I'd last done it seriously, but the fundamentals remained the same: good light, composition, timing, and the ability to see moments that other people might miss. I could learn the new technology, but the eye I'd developed in graduate school was still there, just waiting to be exercised again. Sunday afternoon, I drove into St. Helena and walked through the downtown area with my old Nikon, reloading it with film for the first time in years. The weight of the camera around my neck felt familiar and comforting, like putting on a piece of clothing that had always fit perfectly. I didn't take many shots, just a few of the light falling across storefronts and an elderly couple sharing ice cream on a bench outside the bookstore. But the act of looking through the viewfinder again made me feel more like myself than I had in months. Monday morning, Ben called to check on the cooling system and see how the wine was faring. "Everything's perfect," I told him. "Temperature's holding steady, and I think the Bordeaux collection is going to survive its near-death experience." I paused, then added, "I called an appraiser. I'm going to sell most of it and use the money to set up a photography studio in the basement." "That's fantastic," Ben said, and I could hear genuine excitement in his voice. "How does it feel to make that decision?" "Terrifying and thrilling at the same time," I admitted, "like jumping off a cliff while hoping I remember how to fly." "Those are usually the best kinds of decisions," Ben said. "The safe choices don't teach you anything new about yourself." We talked for a few more minutes about practical considerations for converting the basement, and Ben offered to help with any electrical work I might need for proper studio lighting. It wasn't until after we hung up that I realized how natural it felt to include him in my planning, as if his opinion mattered in ways that went beyond his professional expertise. The wine appraiser, a serious woman named Margaret Chen who specialized in high-end collections, arrived Tuesday morning and spent 3 hours cataloging Richard's bottles. Her assessment was even more encouraging than I'd hoped. "You're looking at somewhere between $40,000 and $60,000, depending on market conditions and how quickly you want to sell," she told me. "Your ex-husband had excellent taste and, apparently, infinite patience. Some of these bottles have appreciated significantly since he bought them." $60,000. It was enough to equip a professional studio, buy new cameras and computers, and still have money left over for marketing and business expenses. It was enough to take photography seriously again instead of treating it like an expensive hobby. The number felt like freedom, like proof that I could rebuild my life on my own terms. I spent the rest of the week researching photography equipment and studio design, reading articles about the latest digital cameras and editing software, and slowly remembering how much I'd loved the technical aspects of the craft as much as the artistic ones. There was something deeply satisfying about understanding exactly how light and chemistry and timing worked together to create an image that captured more than just surface appearance. Friday afternoon, I was sitting at my kitchen table with catalogs and printouts spread everywhere when Ben called again. "How's the studio planning going?" he asked. "I'm completely overwhelmed by how much the technology has changed," I admitted. "I feel like someone who's been asleep for 20 years and woke up in a different world. Digital cameras have capabilities I never dreamed of, but they also seem infinitely more complicated than anything I used to work with." "Want some help figuring it out?" Ben asked. "I don't know much about photography, but I'm pretty good with technology in general, and I have the evening free if you want company while you sort through all the options." I looked around at my kitchen, table covered with research materials, and felt a wave of gratitude for this man who kept showing up at exactly the moments when I needed support most. "That would be wonderful," I said, "but I'm cooking dinner in return. It's the least I can do for someone who's willing to help me enter the 21st century." Ben arrived with a bottle of wine and a willingness to dive into the technical specifications of cameras and lenses with the same methodical approach he brought to repairing cooling systems. Together, we created a spreadsheet comparing different camera bodies, researched software options for digital editing, and identified the essential equipment I'd need to get started. "You don't have to buy everything at once," Ben pointed out as we looked at the growing list. Start with one good camera body and a couple of versatile lenses. You can always add more equipment as your business grows. Business, I repeated, still getting used to thinking of photography as something that could generate income rather than just personal satisfaction. Do you really think people will hire me? I haven't done commercial work in 20 years. Ben looked at me seriously. Rachel, I've seen your old portfolios. You have a gift for capturing something real about people, something that goes beyond just taking a flattering picture. That's exactly what people want when they're hiring a photographer for something important. They want someone who can see who they really are. His confidence in my abilities was simultaneously encouraging and intimidating. What if I'd lost the instinct for seeing what mattered in a photograph? What if 20 years of not using my artistic eye had dulled it beyond recovery? But Ben seemed so certain that my skills were still there, just waiting to be rediscovered, that I found myself believing him. Over dinner, we talked about practical aspects of starting a photography business. How to price services, where to find clients, what kind of insurance I'd need. Ben had started his own HVAC business when he took over from his father, so he understood the challenges of building a customer base and managing the financial uncertainties of self-employment. The hardest part is believing you're worth what you need to charge, he told me. When you're starting out, there's always pressure to underprice your services just to get clients, but that's a trap. If you don't value your work properly, nobody else will either. I thought about all the times during my marriage when I'd minimized my own accomplishments or deflected compliments about my photography, always careful not to seem too proud or too ambitious. Breaking that habit was going to be as challenging as learning new technology. As we cleaned up the dinner dishes, Ben mentioned that his sons were coming to visit the following weekend. "I'd love for you to meet them sometime," he said. "They're at that age where they think they know everything, but they're actually pretty interesting to talk to." The invitation felt significant, a signal that whatever was developing between us was becoming more than just friendly support during a difficult transition. "I'd love to meet them," I said. "It's been a while since I've been around teenagers. My daughter Jessica is 25 now, fully launched into adult life. How does that feel?" Ben asked. "Having your child be completely independent?" "Proud and terrified at the same time," I admitted. Proud because she's become such a capable, caring person, but terrified because I'm not sure who I am when I'm not somebody's mother. That role defined me for so long that without it, I feel a little lost. Ben nodded thoughtfully. "That's part of why I want to go back to school for engineering. My boys are going to be out of the house in a few years, and I don't want to wake up at 55 wondering what I'm supposed to do with the rest of my life." It struck me how much we had in common, both of us navigating the strange territory of middle age, where the roles that had defined us for decades were shifting or disappearing entirely. Both trying to figure out how to build new identities based on who we were, rather than who we'd been expected to be. After Ben left that evening, I sat in my kitchen looking at the organized piles of photography equipment information we'd created together, and I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: excitement about the future. Not just hope that things would get better, but genuine anticipation about projects I wanted to pursue and goals I wanted to achieve. I picked up my phone and called Jessica in Portland. "Mom," she answered after 2 rings, sounding pleased to hear from me. "How are you doing?" "Actually really well," I said, and for the first time since the divorce, I meant it completely. "I've decided to go back to photography. I'm going to set up a studio in the basement and try to build it into a real business." There was a pause, and then Jessica said, "Mom, that's amazing. I've always wondered why you stopped taking pictures. Some of my earliest memories are of you with your camera, always looking for interesting light or asking me to pose by windows. You remember that?" I asked, surprised that my young daughter had paid attention to what must have seemed like just another adult activity. "Of course I remember," Jessica said. "You were different when you had your camera with you. More focused, more yourself somehow." I used to think that was what all moms were like, that everyone's mother was an artist who just happened to be married to dad. The conversation with Jessica lasted over an hour, and by the end of it, I felt like I'd reconnected with my daughter in a way that had been missing since she'd become an adult. She was excited about my plans, full of suggestions for building a social media presence and marketing to younger clients who might want a different kind of photography than the standard wedding and portrait studios offered. After we hung up, I walked through my house looking at it with new eyes. For the first time since Richard left, it felt like a place where I could build something new rather than just a reminder of what I'd lost. The basement would become my studio. The kitchen would be where I met with clients over coffee to discuss their projects, and the whole space would reflect my aesthetic rather than someone else's idea of impressive. I was 50 years old, newly divorced, and about to start over in a career I'd abandoned decades earlier. 6 months ago, that would have felt like a recipe for disaster. Now it felt like the beginning of the most honest chapter of my life. Part 4. Building something real. The wine appraiser had been conservative in her estimates. When the auction house Margaret recommended finished selling Richard's collection 3 weeks later, I had $68,000 in my account and a basement full of empty wine racks waiting to be transformed. I spent my first morning as a newly wealthy woman sitting on the floor of the space that would become my studio, trying to imagine how it would look when filled with cameras and lights and the creative energy I'd been suppressing for 20 years. Ben had volunteered to help with the renovation, and we'd planned to start the electrical work that weekend. But first, I had something I needed to do alone. I drove to San Francisco and spent the afternoon walking through the neighborhoods where I'd taken my best photographs as a young woman, seeing them with older eyes and a different understanding of what made a place worth documenting. Chinatown had changed significantly since my graduate school days, but the essential character remained. Narrow streets crowded with markets and restaurants, elderly people playing cards in Portsmouth Square, children navigating between two cultures, with the fluidity that comes naturally to the young. I walked through North Beach and the Mission, remembering the stories I'd tried to tell with my camera, and thinking about the stories that were waiting to be discovered now. When I got home that evening, I found Ben sitting on my front porch, with 2 cups of coffee and a folder full of electrical diagrams. "I took the liberty of stopping by the coffee shop in town," he explained. "Thought you might want some caffeine before we dive into planning your studio wiring." The gesture was so thoughtful, so perfectly timed to what I needed after an emotional day in the city, that I felt something shift inside me. This man was paying attention to my needs in ways that went beyond simple friendship, and I was beginning to understand that my feelings for him were deepening into something that scared and thrilled me in equal measure. "How was San Francisco?" Ben asked as we settled on the porch with our coffee. "Inspiring and overwhelming," I said. I spent the afternoon walking through places where I used to take pictures, remembering why I fell in love with photography in the first place, but also realizing how much my perspective has changed. I see different things now than I did at 25. "What kinds of things?" Ben asked, genuinely curious. At 25, I was drawn to dramatic moments, obvious stories about struggle and triumph, I explained. Now I'm more interested in quiet moments, the spaces between the big events where people reveal who they really are. Maybe that comes with age, learning to appreciate subtlety over spectacle. Ben nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. When you're young, you want to change the world with grand gestures. When you're older, you realize that most real change happens in small moments, one person at a time." We spent the evening planning the studio layout in detail, marking where electrical outlets would need to be installed for lights and equipment, discussing ventilation requirements for a darkroom area, and sketching out a separate space where I could meet with clients. Ben's engineering background was invaluable for solving practical problems I wouldn't have known to anticipate. "You're going to need more power than the current electrical panel can handle," Ben told me after calculating the requirements for professional photography lighting. "We should upgrade the whole system while we're at it. It'll be more expensive up front, but it'll save you problems down the road. I agreed, trusting his expertise and grateful to have someone who cared enough about my project to suggest the best solution rather than the cheapest one. Money was no longer the primary concern thanks to Richard's wine collection, and I was beginning to understand the luxury of being able to make decisions based on what would work best rather than what I could afford. Saturday morning, Ben arrived, with his electrical supplies and his older son Marcus, a 17-year-old who had inherited his father's height and mechanical aptitude. Marcus was quiet at first, the way teenagers often are around their parents' adult friends, but he warmed up when I asked him about his interest in engineering. "Dad says you're starting a photography business," Marcus said as he helped Ben run new electrical cable through the basement walls. "That's pretty cool. Most adults I know are afraid to try new things. It is pretty terrifying," I admitted, but also exciting in a way I haven't felt in years. Sometimes I think fear and excitement are the same emotion wearing different clothes. Marcus laughed at that, and I could see Ben's smile even though he was focused on connecting wires in the electrical panel. Working alongside them felt natural and comfortable, like being part of a team with a shared goal. I found myself thinking about how long it had been since I'd felt genuinely useful, contributing to something that mattered rather than just maintaining appearances. Sunday, Ben's younger son Tyler joined us, and the basement began to look like a real construction project with tools and materials everywhere, and the steady progress of walls being rewired and spaces being reconfigured. Tyler was 15 and more talkative than his brother, full of questions about photography and stories about his own attempts to take pictures with his phone. "You should show me how to use a real camera sometime," Tyler said as we took a break for lunch. "Phone photography is fine, but it doesn't feel like you're really creating something, you know? I'd love to teach you," I said, meaning it completely. Photography is one of those things that's better when you share it with other people. The technical stuff is important, but the real skill is learning to see what's worth capturing. Ben looked, pleased that his sons were connecting with me, and I realized how important their approval was to whatever was developing between us. These boys were the most important people in Ben's life, and if they didn't like me or felt uncomfortable with my presence, it would complicate everything. But they seemed genuinely interested in both me and the studio project, offering suggestions and asking thoughtful questions about how I planned to find clients and what kind of photographs I wanted to specialize in. By the end of the weekend, they were calling me Rachel instead of Mrs. Henderson and arguing about which of them would be my first official photography student. After the boys left Sunday evening, Ben and I sat in the partially renovated basement, surrounded by the chaos of construction, drinking beer and admiring the progress we'd made. In just 2 days, the space had been transformed from a wine storage area into the foundation of a professional studio. "Your sons are wonderful," I told Ben. "They're smart and funny and clearly adore you. You should be proud of the job you've done raising them." "I can't take all the credit," Ben said. "Their mother deserves most of it, but I'm glad they like you. Their opinion matters more than anyone else's when it comes to people I care about." The phrase hung in the air between us, more loaded with meaning than either of us was quite ready to address directly. People I care about. It was the closest either of us had come to acknowledging that our relationship was becoming something more than friendship, something that might have a future worth planning for. "I care about you too," I said quietly. "More than I expected to, when you first showed up to fix my wine cellar. You've helped me remember who I used to be, but more than that, you've helped me imagine who I might become." Ben reached over and took my hand, the same gesture of comfort and connection he'd made when I stumbled against the wine rack, but this time it felt like a promise rather than just kindness. "We're both figuring it out as we go, aren't we?" he said. Neither of us planned for this. No, I agreed, but sometimes the best things are the ones you never saw coming. That night, after Ben went home, I lay in bed thinking about how dramatically my life had changed in just a few weeks. The wine cellar emergency that had seemed like another expensive problem to solve had turned into the catalyst for rediscovering my passion for photography, and more surprisingly, for opening my heart to the possibility of love again. I was 50 years old, and instead of feeling like my chances for happiness were running out, I felt like I was just beginning to understand what happiness could look like when it wasn't dependent on someone else's approval or limited by someone else's vision of what my life should be. The basement renovation would take another week to complete, and then I could start ordering cameras and equipment and officially launching Henderson Photography. But more than that, I could start building a life that reflected my own choices rather than accommodating someone else's dreams. It felt like the most radical thing I'd ever done. Choosing myself, finally, at an age when most people assumed the important decisions were already made. Part 5. The Test of Real Connection. The photography equipment arrived on a Thursday morning in October, delivered in boxes that transformed my living room into an obstacle course of cameras, lenses, lighting, equipment, and technology I was still learning to use. I spent the day unpacking everything with the excitement of a child on Christmas morning, reading instruction manuals and testing different camera settings until my dining room table was covered with memory cards and lens caps and the detritus of someone getting reacquainted with tools she'd missed more than she'd realized. Ben stopped by after work to see the progress and found me sitting on the floor of my basement studio, surrounded by light stands and reflectors, looking slightly overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I'd committed to. This is either the smartest thing I've ever done or the most expensive midlife crisis in history, I told him, gesturing at the professional-grade equipment that represented months of careful research and a significant portion of my wine money. Definitely the smartest, Ben said, picking up one of my new cameras and examining it with the appreciation of someone who understood quality tools. This is serious equipment, Rachel. You're not playing around anymore. That's what scares me, I admitted. When photography was just a hobby I'd given up, there was no pressure to be good at it. Now that I've invested this much money and energy, I actually have to produce work that's worth paying for. Ben sat down on the floor beside me, close enough that I could smell his aftershave and feel the warmth of his presence. "You know what I think?" he said. "I think you're scared because this matters to you in a way that nothing has mattered for a long time. That's not a bad thing. That's what passion feels like when you haven't experienced it in 20 years. He was right, of course. The anxiety I was feeling wasn't really about the money or the equipment or even the technical challenges of relearning photography in the digital age. It was about caring deeply about something again, about putting myself and my vision into the world in a way that could be judged and potentially found wanting. But the alternative, staying safe and unambitious and disconnected from my own creative impulses, no longer felt like protection. It felt like a different kind of death, slower, but just as final. Ben helped me set up the first lighting system that evening, and we spent hours experimenting with different configurations and testing how the new equipment worked in the space we'd created. The basement had been completely transformed with professional-grade electrical systems, proper ventilation, and carefully planned areas for different types of photography work. "Try taking a picture of me," Ben suggested as we finished adjusting the main lighting setup. "I want to see how this looks through your new camera." I hesitated for a moment, suddenly self-conscious about photographing someone whose opinion mattered to me. But Ben positioned himself near the window, where the natural light mixed beautifully with the artificial lighting we'd set up. Through the viewfinder, I could see why I'd fallen in love with photography in the first place. Ben's face was thoughtful and kind, with laugh lines around his eyes and the sort of quiet confidence that comes from someone who knows how to solve problems with his hands. I took several shots, adjusting the settings between each frame, and when I looked at the results on the camera's LCD screen, I felt a surge of satisfaction I hadn't experienced in decades. The images captured something essential about Ben's character, the combination of gentleness and strength that had drawn me to him from our first conversation. More importantly, they proved to myself that my instincts for composition and timing were still intact, just waiting to be exercised again. "These are really good," Ben said, looking over my shoulder at the camera display. "You can see the moment when you remembered what you were doing. The first few shots are nice, but this last one is something special." He was right. In the final image, something had clicked into place, the same feeling I remembered from my best work in graduate school when everything aligned perfectly. Light, composition, timing, and that indefinable quality that separates a snapshot from a photograph that tells a story. "I think I'm ready to start advertising," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. "I need to practice more with the new equipment, but the basic skills are still there. I can feel them coming back." Ben smiled and squeezed my shoulder. I never doubted it for a second. The next morning, I created a simple website for Henderson Photography and posted an announcement on the local community Facebook page, offering portrait sessions at a significant discount for my first 10 clients. I was nervous about putting myself out there professionally after so many years away from the field, but I also knew that the only way to rebuild my confidence was to start working with real people who had real expectations. My phone rang within 2 hours of posting the announcement. The caller was Maria Santos, a woman about my age who wanted family portraits for her upcoming 50th birthday celebration. "We have 4 generations of women in our family," she explained. "My grandmother, my mother, me, and my 2 daughters. I want photographs that show the connections between us, not just the standard posed family pictures." It was exactly the kind of project I'd dreamed about when I was planning my return to photography. We scheduled a session for the following weekend, and I spent the intervening days researching techniques for multi-generational portraits and practicing with different lighting setups in my new studio. Ben stopped by Friday evening to check on my preparation and found me in a state of creative excitement mixed with professional anxiety. "I've been thinking about this session all week," I told him. "It's the perfect opportunity to do the kind of work I've always wanted to do. But what if I've lost the ability to connect with clients? What if I can't create the intimacy that makes a portrait meaningful?" "You're overthinking it," Ben said gently. "The reason Maria called you instead of one of the established studios in town is because she could tell from your announcement that you understand what she's looking for. Trust your instincts and remember that good photography is mostly about making people feel comfortable enough to be themselves." Saturday morning arrived clear and bright. Perfect weather for the outdoor portion of the Santos family session I'd planned. Maria met me at the designated location, a small park with beautiful oak trees that provided natural shade and interesting light patterns. She was accompanied by her 80-year-old mother, her 55-year-old mother-in-law, and her 2 daughters, ages 22 and 19. The women were initially a bit stiff and formal, the way people often are when they're not used to being photographed professionally. But as I worked with them, adjusting poses and encouraging natural interactions, they began to relax and reveal the genuine affection and humor that characterized their relationships with each other. I photographed them in various combinations. All 5 together, the 3 older women sharing stories, the 2 young women laughing with their mother, and individual portraits that captured each woman's unique personality and stage of life. The session lasted 3 hours, and by the end, we were all laughing together as if we'd been friends for years. When I reviewed the images that evening, I knew I'd created something special. The photographs told the story Maria had wanted, the way her daughters looked at her with a mixture of love and exasperation that's unique to adult children, the pride in her mother's eyes when she looked at the family she'd helped create, the bonds that connected these women across 50 years of shared history. More than that, the session had reminded me why I'd become a photographer in the first place. There's something magical about the moment when people forget about the camera and allow their genuine selves to emerge. Those are the moments that make a portrait more than just a record of someone's appearance. They become a window into character and connection. Ben came over Sunday evening to see how the session had gone, and I showed him the preliminary selections on my computer. "These are incredible," he said, studying an image of Maria's grandmother reaching out to touch her great-granddaughter's face. with the gentle reverence of someone who has watched multiple generations grow up. You can see the love in every gesture. I felt more professionally confident than I had in years, but more than that, I felt like I'd rediscovered a part of myself that had been dormant for too long. Photography wasn't just a way to make money or fill my time. It was how I made sense of the world, how I found and shared the beauty that exists in ordinary moments when someone takes the time to really look. Maria called the next morning to schedule a second session for extended family members who had seen the preliminary images and wanted portraits of their own. Word of mouth, she explained, is already spreading. People are saying, "You have a gift," for making them feel beautiful instead of just photographed. By the end of October, I had bookings scheduled through Christmas and a waiting list for the new year. The photography business that had started as a way to reclaim my identity was becoming a sustainable career, and more importantly, it was work that felt meaningful and connected to my deepest values about human dignity and the importance of really seeing each other. Ben had been my most consistent supporter throughout the process, helping with technical problems, celebrating successes, and providing steady encouragement when I doubted my abilities. Our relationship had deepened naturally as we worked together, on the studio, and as he became part of my return to photography, but we'd been careful not to rush into anything that might complicate the friendship that had become so important to both of us. That changed on a Friday evening in early November, when Ben arrived at my house looking unusually serious and carrying a bottle of champagne. "I have news," he announced. "I applied to UC Davis for their environmental engineering program, and I just found out I was accepted for the spring semester." I felt a complex mix of emotions: excitement for Ben's opportunity to pursue his original dream, pride in his courage to make such a significant change at our age, and beneath it all, a flutter of anxiety about what this might mean for our relationship. Davis was only an hour away, but returning to school would dramatically change Ben's schedule and priorities. "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it completely. "You've been talking about going back to school for months. This is exactly what you need to do." Ben opened the champagne and poured 2 glasses, then looked at me with an expression that was both nervous and hopeful. "There's something else," he said. "The program is designed for working professionals, mostly evening and weekend classes. I'll still be able to run the HVAC business, and I'll still be here most of the time." "I'm not going anywhere, Rachel." The relief I felt was probably more obvious than I intended, because Ben stepped closer and took my hand. "I've been thinking about this decision for weeks," he continued. "Not just the school part, but what it means for us. I don't want to start something new in my life without knowing that you'll be part of it." "Ben," I said softly, "what are you saying?" "I'm saying that I love you," he replied, his voice steady and certain. "I love your passion for photography, your kindness to my sons, your courage in rebuilding your life after everything fell apart. I love the way you see beauty in ordinary moments, and the way you make me want to be braver about my own dreams." I felt tears start in my eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming gratitude of being truly seen and appreciated by someone whose opinion mattered to me. "I love you too," I said. "I didn't expect to feel this way again, especially not at 50, but you've shown me that it's possible to build something real when both people are committed to growing instead of just staying safe." We stood in my kitchen holding each other, surrounded by the life I'd rebuilt from the ground up. And I understood that this was what mature love could look like. Not the desperate passion of youth, but the steady warmth of 2 people who had learned from their mistakes and were ready to choose each other deliberately and with full knowledge of what they were committing to. The next few weeks brought a series of small but significant changes as Ben and I began to integrate our lives more intentionally. He started spending more nights at my house, and I met his ex-wife Karen when she came to pick up the boys one Saturday afternoon. She was gracious and friendly, clearly relieved that Ben had found someone who made him happy and who got along well with Marcus and Tyler. "You're good for him," Karen told me privately while Ben was loading equipment into his truck. "He's been stuck for years." afraid to take risks because he didn't want to disrupt the boys' stability. But watching him apply to school and start planning for the future, it's like he's remembered that he's allowed to want things for himself, too. The photography business continued to grow throughout November and December, and I found myself booking sessions for families who specifically sought me out because of my reputation for creating portraits that felt authentic rather than artificial. I was developing a style that emphasized natural light and genuine interaction, and clients consistently told me that the experience of being photographed felt more like a conversation than a formal photo session. One of my favorite projects that fall was documenting the Santos family's 50th birthday celebration for Maria. 3 generations of women gathered in my client's backyard for an afternoon of food, stories, and the kind of easy intimacy that comes from decades of shared history. I moved through the party almost invisibly, capturing moments of connection and joy that the family members were too busy living to notice themselves. When I delivered the final images, Maria cried looking at a photograph of her mother dancing with her granddaughter, both of them laughing with the pure delight of being together in a moment that would never come again, exactly the same way. "This is why photographs matter," she said. "Not because they show us how we looked, but because they remind us how we felt." By Christmas, Ben and I had established a rhythm that felt sustainable and hopeful. He was excelling in his first semester, back in school, energized by the intellectual challenges and clear about his goal of transitioning into environmental consulting within the next few years. I was booked solid with photography sessions and had started planning a gallery show for the following spring, featuring portraits of women over 50 who had reinvented their lives in significant ways. We spent Christmas Eve at Ben's house with Marcus and Tyler, cooking dinner together and exchanging gifts that reflected how well we'd come to know each other over the past 8 months. Ben gave me a vintage camera bag that had belonged to his grandfather, who had been an amateur photographer, and I gave him a book about sustainable engineering practices signed by an author he'd mentioned admiring. But the gift that mattered most was harder to quantify. The sense of being part of a family again, not because of legal obligations or social expectations, but because we'd chosen each other and committed to building something together that honored all of our individual dreams and priorities. As we sat around Ben's fireplace that evening, I thought about how dramatically my life had changed since the day my wine cellar cooling system failed and brought Ben Martinez into my world. I'd expected him to fix my temperature control and leave, another professional service provider solving a problem I couldn't handle myself. Instead, he'd helped me fix things I didn't even realize were broken. My connection to my own creative passion, my confidence in my ability to build a life on my own terms, and my faith that love could be something other than compromise and accommodation. I was 50 years old, and this wasn't my last chance at love. It was my first chance at the kind of love that enhances rather than diminishes the people involved, the kind that grows stronger when both partners are pursuing their individual dreams as well as their shared goals. On New Year's Eve, Ben and I hosted a party for my photography clients and his friends from school, filling my house with people who represented the new life we were building together. As midnight approached, we stepped out onto the back patio to get some air and found ourselves alone under the stars that stretched over the Napa Valley vineyards. This time last year, I never could have imagined this, I told Ben, gesturing toward the house full of friends and the life that felt genuinely mine for the first time in decades. "Me either," Ben replied, pulling me closer. "But maybe that's the point. The best things happen when you stop trying to control everything and start being open to possibilities you never considered." As we kissed at midnight, surrounded by the sound of celebration from inside the house and the quiet beauty of the valley we'd both learned to call home, I understood that 50 hadn't been too late for anything. It had been exactly the right time to stop living someone else's idea of my life and start creating something authentic and joyful and entirely my own. The wine cellar that had brought us together was now my photography studio, filled with equipment and creativity and the steady pursuit of meaningful work. The house that had once felt too big and too quiet was now a gathering place for people who mattered to us. and the woman who had once thought her chances for happiness were behind her had discovered that the most important chapters of her story were just beginning. Ben was right about one thing. The best decisions are usually the ones that feel terrifying and thrilling at the same time. And at 50, I was finally brave enough to make those kinds of decisions on a regular basis, to choose growth over safety and authenticity over approval. It turned out that starting over wasn't about erasing the past or pretending that previous chapters hadn't mattered. It was about using everything you'd learned to build something better, something that honored both who you'd been and who you were becoming. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, you found someone who wanted to build that better life alongside you, not because they needed you to complete them, but because they loved who you were when you were most completely yourself. That was the kind of love worth waiting 50 years to find. Spring arrived in Napa Valley with an explosion of color that made me reach for my camera every morning. The vineyards were coming alive with new growth, and the light had that particular quality that photographers dream about, soft and golden and forgiving to everything it touched. I'd been documenting the changing seasons as part of a personal project, creating a visual diary of my first year as a working photographer again, and the images captured more than just the landscape. They showed my own transformation, the way my eye had sharpened and my confidence had grown with each passing month. The gallery show I'd been planning for months was finally happening. Reinvention, Portraits of Women Over 50, would open at a small but respected gallery in downtown Napa in 2 weeks, featuring 24 portraits of women who had made significant life changes after their 50th birthdays. The project had grown organically from my own experience, and each woman I'd photographed had shared stories that both inspired and humbled me. There was Elena, a retired teacher who had started a nonprofit providing literacy services to Spanish-speaking adults. Patricia, who had left her corporate law career to become a ceramic artist. Dr. Joan Martinez, who had returned to medical school at 52 to specialize in geriatric care after watching her own mother struggle with inadequate health care. Each portrait captured not just their physical appearance, but something essential about their spirit, their determination to write new chapters instead of accepting that their stories were essentially finished. Ben had been invaluable in helping me prepare for the show, not just with the technical aspects of printing and framing, but with the emotional support I needed to put my work in front of the public for the first time in over 20 years. We spent evenings in my studio, fine-tuning the selection of images and discussing the stories behind each portrait. His engineering background gave him a different perspective on composition and visual problem-solving that challenged me to think more carefully about how each photograph communicated its message. "You know what strikes me about all these women?" Ben said one evening as we arranged prints on the studio floor, testing different combinations for the gallery wall layout. "They all have this quality of being fully present in their own lives, not performing for anyone else or trying to meet expectations, just completely themselves." "That's exactly what I was trying to capture," I replied. "There's something that happens when you stop apologizing for who you are and start embracing it instead. It shows up in people's faces, in the way they hold themselves, even in the way they look at the camera." Ben picked up the portrait of Maria Santos that had started the whole project, the image of her surrounded by 4 generations of women in her family. "This one especially," he said. "You can see how proud she is, not just of her family, but of herself for creating this moment, for insisting that these connections matter enough to be documented." The week before the gallery opening, I received a phone call that changed everything. The caller identified herself as Rebecca Chen, a senior editor at a national magazine that focused on lifestyle and culture for women over 40. "We've been following your work through social media," she explained. "One of our contributors saw your upcoming gallery show and sent us your portfolio. We'd like to feature your reinvention project in our fall issue, and we're interested in commissioning you for a series of similar portraits across the country." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, trying to process what she was telling me. A national magazine wanted to feature my work and potentially hire me for ongoing assignments. It was the kind of recognition I'd dreamed about in graduate school, but had stopped imagining was possible once I'd been away from photography for so long. "We'd want to send a writer to interview you about your own reinvention story," Rebecca continued. "The angle would be about women who rediscover their passion and talent after major life transitions. It fits perfectly with our magazine's mission of celebrating women who refuse to accept limitations based on age or circumstances." After we finished the call, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at the phone and trying to understand how my life had changed so dramatically in the span of one conversation. 9 months ago, I'd been a newly divorced woman with no clear sense of purpose or direction. Now I was potentially on the verge of a photography career that could reach audiences I'd never imagined. When Ben arrived that evening, I was still processing the magazine's offer and what it might mean for our relationship and the life we'd been building together. A national assignment would require travel, probably weeks away from home at a time. How would that work with Ben's school schedule and his responsibilities to his sons? Were we strong enough as a couple to handle that kind of separation and uncertainty? Ben listened to my concerns with the patient attention he brought to all complicated problems, asking clarifying questions and helping me think through the practical implications of accepting such a significant opportunity. But when I finished explaining all my worries, his response was simpler and more direct than I'd expected. "Rachel," he said, "this is exactly what you've been working toward. You've spent months building a photography business that celebrates women who take risks and pursue their dreams. Now you have the chance to take that message national, to reach women all over the country who might need to see that it's possible to start over and create something meaningful. How could you turn that down?" "But what about us?" I asked. "What about the life we're building here?" Ben smiled and took my hands in his. "The life we're building isn't about staying in one place or maintaining a specific routine," he said. "It's about supporting each other's growth and celebrating when opportunities like this come along. I want to be with a woman who's pursuing her biggest dreams, not someone who plays it safe to avoid complications." His certainty helped calm my anxiety, but I still had practical concerns about managing a national career from a small town in Northern California. We spent the evening researching the magazine, looking up their previous features, and understanding their audience and editorial approach. By the time we went to bed, I had decided to accept their offer and see where it might lead. The gallery opening was more successful than I'd dared to hope. Over 200 people attended, including many of the women I'd photographed and their families. The gallery was filled with the energy of celebration and recognition, conversations about art and aging, and the courage it takes to reinvent yourself when everyone expects you to be settled and predictable. Several local newspapers sent reviewers, and the mayor gave a short speech about the importance of supporting artists who tell stories that matter to the community. But the moment that meant the most to me was watching Ben's sons, Marcus and Tyler, as they walked through the exhibition, with their friends, clearly proud to be connected to something that was generating so much positive attention. Maria Santos brought her extended family to see her portrait prominently displayed near the gallery entrance, and I watched her mother study the image with the focused attention of someone seeing herself through an artist's eyes for the first time. "It's a good picture," the older woman said finally. "It shows who we really are, not just what we look like." That comment encapsulated everything I'd hoped to achieve with the project. Too often, portraits of older women focus on hiding signs of aging or creating an idealized version of their subjects. I wanted to create images that celebrated the character that comes with experience, the beauty that emerges when someone has lived fully and honestly. Rebecca Chen attended the opening as part of her research for the magazine article, and we spent an hour walking through the exhibition while she asked questions about my process and my motivations for returning to photography. She was particularly interested in how my own experience of reinvention had shaped my approach to photographing other women in similar transitions. "What I find compelling about your work," she told me, is that you're not presenting these women as inspirational figures who've overcome impossible odds. You're showing them as normal people who made choices that required courage. It makes their stories feel accessible rather than intimidating. The magazine article was scheduled to run in September, with a 12-page spread featuring 8 of the portraits, along with excerpts from my interviews with each subject. Rebecca also confirmed the commission for a national series that would take me to 6 different cities over the following year, documenting women who had made significant career or life changes after 50. 2 weeks after the gallery opening, I received another unexpected call. This one was from the curator of a photography museum in San Francisco, asking if I would be interested in expanding the Reinvention project into a larger exhibition that could travel to museums in other cities. She'd seen the magazine's advance coverage of my work and thought it would resonate with audiences nationwide. We're particularly interested in projects that challenge stereotypes about aging and women's potential for growth and creativity, the curator explained. Your portraits do exactly that while maintaining the highest artistic standards. We'd love to discuss the possibility of a solo show. Ben and I celebrated that evening with dinner at our favorite restaurant in downtown Napa, toasting not just my professional success, but the journey that had brought us both to this point. A year ago, I never could have imagined this, I told him as we shared a bottle of wine from a local vineyard we'd visited together the previous month. A year ago, Ben replied, you were so focused on what you'd lost that you couldn't see what was possible. Now look where you are. He was right. The divorce that had felt like a catastrophic ending had actually been the beginning of the most creatively fulfilling period of my life. Losing the identity I'd built around being Richard's wife had forced me to remember who I was before that marriage, and to imagine who I might become if I stopped limiting myself to other people's expectations. The national magazine feature generated more interest than either Rebecca or I had anticipated. My phone started ringing with requests from women all over the country who wanted to be photographed as part of similar projects in their own communities. A literary agent contacted me about writing a book that would combine the portraits with essays about reinvention and the courage it takes to start over in midlife. More importantly, I began receiving letters and emails from women who had seen the magazine article and felt inspired to make changes in their own lives. Some were small steps, taking art classes, starting exercise programs, or reconnecting with old friends. Others were more dramatic, leaving unfulfilling marriages, changing careers, or pursuing dreams they'd deferred for decades. One letter particularly moved me. It was from a 53-year-old woman in Ohio who had been working as an office administrator for the same company for 30 years while secretly writing poetry in her spare time. After reading about my return to photography, she had submitted her poems to a literary magazine for the first time and had just received news that 3 of them would be published. Your story showed me that it's not too late to take my writing seriously, she wrote. I've been telling myself for years that poetry is just a hobby, but seeing how you transformed your life by reclaiming your art made me realize I was using my age as an excuse to avoid taking risks. Letters like that reminded me why the work mattered beyond my own personal fulfillment. In a culture that often treats women over 50 as invisible or irrelevant, documenting stories of continued growth and creativity was a form of activism as much as artistry. Ben's engineering program was progressing well, and he'd been accepted for an internship with an environmental consulting firm that summer. We'd learned to coordinate our schedules so that my travel for photography assignments didn't conflict with his major commitments, and we'd developed systems for staying connected when we were apart for work. Our relationship had matured into something that felt both exciting and stable, built on mutual respect for each other's professional goals and personal growth. We'd moved in together the previous month, combining our households in a way that honored both of our needs for independence and connection. The house that had once felt too large and echoing with Richard's absence now felt perfectly sized for the life Ben and I were creating together. His sons had their own rooms for weekend visits, my photography studio occupied the basement, and we'd converted the former wine tasting room into Ben's study space for his engineering coursework. On a warm evening in late spring, as we sat on the back patio planning our summer travel schedule, Ben brought up a conversation we'd been avoiding for months. "I've been thinking about what happens after I graduate," he said. "The internship could turn into a full-time position, but it would mean relocating to Portland." "Portland?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice neutral while I processed this information. "That's a significant change." "It is," Ben agreed. "But it's also exactly the kind of environmental work I've been preparing for. The firm specializes in renewable energy projects and sustainable development. It's everything I hoped for when I decided to go back to school." I understood the opportunity he was describing and how important it was for his long-term career goals. But the thought of leaving Napa Valley and the photography community I'd worked so hard to build felt overwhelming. My business was finally established, my reputation was growing, and I had roots here that had taken months to develop. "What about your photography business?" Ben asked, reading my thoughts. "Could you do the kind of work you're doing from Portland? Or would you be interested in expanding into different types of photography?" I'd been so focused on building a sustainable career in portraiture that I hadn't seriously considered other possibilities. But Ben's question made me think about how my work might evolve if I were open to new challenges and environments. Portland had a thriving arts community and a population that would likely be receptive to the kind of documentary work I'd been developing. "We don't have to decide anything right now," Ben said. "The internship is just for the summer, and I wouldn't graduate until next spring. But I wanted us to start talking about it so we can make decisions together instead of separately." That conversation initiated a series of discussions about our shared future that continued over the following weeks. We talked about the importance of supporting each other's career goals, about the difference between compromise and sacrifice, and about how to build a life together that honored both of our individual dreams and our commitment to each other. I realized that my initial resistance to leaving Napa Valley was partly about fear of change, and partly about not wanting to abandon the success I'd worked so hard to achieve. But as Ben and I explored the possibilities, I began to see relocation, not as a loss but as a potential expansion of my work and my horizons. The National Photography Project was teaching me that compelling stories existed everywhere, and that my skills as a portraitist could be valuable in any community where women were navigating transitions and challenges. Maybe the question wasn't whether I could build a successful photography business in Portland, but whether I was brave enough to keep growing instead of settling for what felt safe and familiar. By midsummer, I had made my decision. When Ben's internship ended and he received the offer for a permanent position in Portland, I encouraged him to accept it. We would relocate together the following spring, after he graduated and after I completed the current round of magazine assignments. The decision felt both terrifying and exhilarating, exactly the kind of choice that had been transforming my life since the day Ben first walked into my kitchen to fix a broken wine cellar cooling system. I was 51 years old, successful, in a career I'd rebuilt from scratch, and in love with a man who supported my ambitions as enthusiastically as I supported his. 6 months earlier, I would have said that kind of happiness was probably beyond reach at my age. Now I understood that age had nothing to do with it. What mattered was the willingness to keep choosing growth over comfort, possibility over security, and love over fear. The wine cellar that had brought Ben and me together was now a photography studio, where I created images that celebrated women's capacity for reinvention and continued growth. The house that had once symbolized a failed marriage was now a home where we planned adventures and supported each other's dreams. And the woman who had once thought 50 might be her last chance at love had discovered that it was actually her first chance at a relationship built on genuine partnership and mutual respect for each other's authentic selves. Sometimes the best stories begin with something breaking down. What looks like a crisis turns out to be an opportunity, and what feels like an ending becomes the foundation for a beginning you never could have imagined. I was ready for whatever came next, because I'd learned that the most important adventures Start when you're brave enough to say yes to possibilities that scare and thrill you in equal measure. And when you're lucky enough to find someone who wants to take those adventures alongside you, 50 doesn't feel like a limitation at all. It feels like just the beginning. 2 years later, I stood in our Portland loft apartment, looking out at the Willamette River through floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the morning light paint the water in shades of gold and amber that reminded me why I'd fallen in love with photography in the first place. The space was everything Ben and I had dreamed of when we'd made the decision to leave Napa Valley. High ceilings perfect for portrait lighting, exposed brick walls that provided texture and character, and enough room for both my expanded photography studio and Ben's home office where he worked on environmental consulting projects. The move had been more challenging than either of us had anticipated, not because of logistics or career transitions, but because leaving the place where we'd fallen in love and rebuilt our lives felt like closing a chapter before we were entirely ready. The house in Napa had sold quickly to a young couple who appreciated its history and potential, and I'd shipped my photography equipment north with the mixture of excitement and trepidation that comes with any major life change. But Portland had surprised us both with how quickly it began to feel like home. The city's commitment to sustainability aligned perfectly with Ben's professional values, and the thriving arts community provided more opportunities for meaningful photography work than I'd encountered anywhere else. Within 6 months of moving, I'd established relationships with 3 different galleries and had a waiting list of clients who wanted the kind of intimate, character-driven portraits that had become my signature style. The national magazine series had evolved into something larger and more significant than any of us had originally envisioned. What had started as a simple photo essay about women over 50 had become a traveling exhibition that had visited 12 cities, a coffee table book that had spent 8 weeks on bestseller lists, and a documentary film that was scheduled to premiere at several film festivals in the coming year. More importantly, the project had connected me with hundreds of women across the country who were navigating their own reinventions, creating a network of support and inspiration that extended far beyond photography. I received emails daily from women who had seen the exhibition or read the book and had been motivated to make changes in their own lives, from small adjustments to major transformations. Ben's environmental consulting work had flourished as well, and he'd become a recognized expert in renewable energy systems for urban development projects. His engineering degree had opened doors to exactly the kind of work he'd dreamed about during those evening classes in Davis, and he approached each project with the same methodical problem-solving skills that had made him such an excellent HVS technician. Our relationship had deepened and matured in ways that continued to surprise me. Living together full-time, navigating career pressures and travel schedules and the daily negotiations that come with sharing a life, we'd learned to communicate with the kind of honesty and directness that I'd never experienced in my marriage. To Richard, Ben and I fought sometimes, but we fought fairly and always with the understanding that we were on the same team working toward shared goals. Marcus had graduated from high school and was studying mechanical engineering at Oregon State, following in his father's footsteps, but with his own interests in robotics and automation. Tyler was a senior now, already accepted to several colleges and planning to study environmental science. Both boys had adapted to the move better than Ben had feared, and they spent most holidays and school breaks with us in Portland, treating our loft as a second home where they could pursue their own interests while staying connected to their father. The relationship between Ben's sons and me had evolved naturally from cautious friendship to genuine affection. I wasn't trying to replace their mother, and they weren't looking for a replacement, but we'd found our own dynamic based on shared interests and mutual respect. Marcus had developed a real passion for photography and often served as my assistant during portrait sessions, while Tyler was fascinated by the business side of my work and had helped me develop more efficient systems for client management and scheduling. One evening in late fall, as we were preparing dinner together in our Portland kitchen, Ben brought up a conversation we'd been circling around for months. "Rachel," he said, carefully slicing vegetables with the precision he brought to all detailed. "Work." I've been thinking about something and I want to know how you feel about it. I looked up from the salmon I was seasoning, noting the slightly nervous tone in his voice that usually appeared when he was about to suggest something significant. What kind of something? I asked. Ben set down his knife and turned to face me directly. I want to ask you to marry me, he said. Not because I think we need to prove anything to anyone or because there's some timeline we're supposed to follow, but because I love building a life with you and I want to make that commitment official. I felt my heart skip in a way that seemed ridiculous for a 52-year-old woman, but Ben's proposal was so perfectly characteristic of his thoughtful, deliberate approach to important decisions that I couldn't help smiling. Are you asking me now? Or are you asking if you can ask me? I said, teasing him gently. I'm asking you now, Ben replied, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a simple platinum band set with a single diamond that was exactly the style I would have chosen for myself. Rachel Henderson, will you marry me? The ring was beautiful, but what moved me most was the certainty in Ben's voice, the complete absence of doubt or anxiety that had characterized so many of the major decisions in my first marriage. This wasn't a man asking because he thought he should, or because external pressures demanded it. This was someone who had thought carefully about what he wanted and was confident enough in our relationship to believe I might want the same thing. Yes, I said, letting him slide the ring onto my finger where it felt immediately natural and right. Yes, I want to marry you and keep building this life we've created together. We spent the evening making plans, not for an elaborate wedding that would impress other people, but for a ceremony that would reflect our values and priorities. We decided on a small gathering in the gardens of a Portland museum, with only our children and closest friends in attendance. The focus would be on commitment and celebration rather than performance, on the promise we were making to each other rather than meeting social expectations about what a wedding should look like. Planning the wedding gave us opportunities to discuss our hopes and concerns about marriage in a way that felt both practical and romantic. We'd both been married before, both experienced the ways that good intentions could gradually erode under the pressures of daily life and unspoken expectations. This time, we were determined to be more intentional about communication, more honest about our individual needs, and more committed to supporting each other's continued growth as individuals. Ben's sons were thrilled about the engagement, particularly Tyler, who immediately appointed himself wedding photographer and began researching techniques for capturing outdoor ceremonies in natural light. Marcus offered to play guitar during the ceremony, a gesture that touched me more than he probably realized. Their enthusiasm made me feel like I was gaining family members rather than just acquiring stepchildren, and their easy acceptance helped quiet any lingering concerns I had about disrupting the established dynamic between Ben and his boys. Jessica flew in from Portland to help with wedding preparations, and I was struck by how much she'd matured since my divorce 3 years earlier. She was now 28 and had recently been promoted to a senior position at her nonprofit organization, but more than her professional success, I was impressed by her emotional intelligence and her genuine excitement about my upcoming marriage. You're different with Ben than you were with Dad, she told me one afternoon as we shopped for flowers for the ceremony. More yourself, if that makes sense. With Dad, you always seemed like you were trying to be the person he wanted you to be. With Ben, you just are who you are. Her observation was perceptive and accurate. My relationship with Ben was built on acceptance and appreciation, rather than the constant negotiation and compromise that had characterized my marriage to Richard. Ben loved the ambitious photographer who traveled for assignments and worked late in her studio, not despite those qualities, but because of them. He supported my professional goals not as sacrifices he was making for my happiness, but as opportunities to celebrate what made me uniquely myself. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning with the kind of perfect autumn light that made everything look like it belonged in a painting. Our small group of family and friends gathered among the chrysanthemums and late-blooming roses, while Marcus played acoustic guitar and Tyler documented everything with the serious concentration of someone who understood that these moments would become precious memories. Ben and I had written our own vows, and when the time came to speak them aloud, I felt the same sense of rightness that had characterized our entire relationship. I promised to support his dreams while pursuing my own, to communicate honestly even when it was difficult, and to continue growing as an individual while building something meaningful together. Ben's vows focused on partnership and respect, on his commitment to loving me as I was while encouraging me to become everything I was capable of being. He promised to share domestic responsibilities, to celebrate my professional successes, and to approach our marriage as a collaboration between equals rather than a traditional arrangement where one person's needs took precedence over the other's. After the ceremony, we hosted a casual reception at our loft, with catered food from our favorite local restaurants and music that reflected both of our tastes. The afternoon felt relaxed and joyful, filled with conversation and laughter, and the kind of authentic celebration that happens when people gather to honor something they genuinely believe in. But the moment that meant the most to me came later. That evening, after all the guests had gone home and Ben and I were cleaning up together in our kitchen. As we washed dishes and put away leftover food, moving around each other with the easy coordination that comes from months of shared domestic routines, I realized that this was what marriage looked like when it was working properly: partnership. In the mundane tasks as well as the significant moments, equal investment in maintaining the life you've built together. The first year of our marriage brought new challenges and opportunities that tested our ability to support each other through both successes and setbacks. My photography career reached new heights when the documentary film about the reinvention project won awards at several festivals and led to opportunities for international exhibitions. I was invited to speak at conferences about art and aging, and a major publisher approached me about writing a second book. But success also brought pressures and demands that were sometimes difficult to navigate. Increased travel meant longer separations from Ben, and the attention my work was receiving created opportunities that would require even more time away from home. We had to learn to negotiate these competing priorities, to make decisions about which opportunities were worth pursuing and which might compromise the relationship we'd worked so hard to build. Ben faced his own professional challenges when the consulting firm offered him a promotion that would involve significant travel to renewable energy projects around the Pacific Northwest. The position represented everything he'd hoped for when he'd returned to school, but it would also mean coordinating two demanding travel schedules and finding ways to maintain connection despite frequent absences. We addressed these challenges the way we approached all significant decisions, with honest conversation, careful planning, and mutual commitment to finding solutions that honored both of our professional goals. We invested in better communication, technology, learned to coordinate calendars months in advance, and developed rituals for staying emotionally connected even when we were physically apart. More importantly, we discovered that our individual successes enhanced rather than threatened our relationship when we approached them as shared victories rather than competing priorities. Ben's expertise in renewable energy systems led to collaborations with artists working on environmentally focused projects, and my photography skills proved valuable for documenting the community impact of his consulting work. One of the most significant projects we worked on together was a photo essay documenting the human impact of a solar energy installation in a rural Oregon community. I photographed families whose lives had been improved by access to reliable, affordable electricity, while Ben provided technical expertise about the engineering challenges and environmental benefits of the project. The resulting exhibition toured environmental science museums across the country and demonstrated how our different skills could complement each other in meaningful ways. Tyler graduated from high school that spring and chose to attend college in Portland, partly because he wanted to stay connected to the environmental science community that Ben had introduced him to, but also because he'd come to think of our loft as his second home. Having him nearby for his college years felt like an unexpected gift, and his presence added energy and perspective to our household that both Ben and I valued. Marcus completed his engineering degree and took a position with a robotics company in Seattle, close enough for regular visits, but far enough to establish his independence as a young adult. Watching Ben navigate the transition to having adult children who were building their own lives reminded me of my own experience with Jessica's growing independence, and I appreciated having a partner who understood the mixture of pride and melancholy that comes with successful parenting. On our second wedding anniversary, Ben and I took a trip to Italy, combining work and pleasure by documenting traditional craft artists in Tuscany for a magazine assignment, while also celebrating our marriage and everything we'd built together. The trip gave us uninterrupted time to reflect on our journey from that first meeting in my Napa Valley kitchen to our current life as married partners with thriving careers and strong family relationships. One evening, as we sat in a hillside restaurant overlooking the vineyards that reminded us both of where we'd fallen in love, Ben raised his wine glass in a toast. "To second chances," he said, "and to the courage it takes to keep choosing each other every day." I clinked my glass against his, thinking about all the ways our lives had exceeded what either of us had dared to hope for when we were newly divorced, and struggling to imagine what happiness might look like in our 50s. To discovering that, the best chapters come when you stop trying to write the story you think you're supposed to have and start writing the one you actually want, I replied. The magazine feature about our Italian trip included not just photographs of the artisans we documented, but also images of Ben and me working together, planning shots, and discussing the stories behind each portrait. The editor noted in her introduction that our collaboration represented something she saw more frequently now: couples who supported each other's professional ambitions while building genuine partnerships based on mutual respect and shared values. That observation reflected a broader trend I'd noticed in my photography work. Many of the women I was documenting in their 50s and 60s were finding love for the first or second time with partners who appreciated their independence and ambition, rather than feeling threatened by it. These relationships looked different from traditional marriages because they were built on the foundation of two complete individuals choosing to share their lives, rather than two people trying to complete each other or fulfill predetermined roles. By our third anniversary, Ben and I had developed rhythms and traditions that felt sustainable and meaningful. We hosted an annual dinner party for Marcus and Tyler's birthdays, maintained a shared photography project documenting the changing seasons in Portland, and had established a travel fund that allowed us to take at least one international trip each year to places that offered opportunities for both environmental research and documentary photography. We'd also learned to navigate the challenges that come with any long-term relationship: disagreements about money and scheduling, different approaches to household management, and the occasional periods when work stress or family obligations created tension between us. But we'd developed tools for addressing these issues directly and constructively, always with the understanding that our commitment to each other was strong enough to withstand temporary difficulties. The photography business had evolved beyond portraiture to include documentary work, commercial assignments, and educational workshops where I taught other women about using art as a tool for processing life transitions. I'd published 2 books, had work in permanent museum collections, and had been invited to teach masterclasses at photography schools around the country. But the work that continued to mean the most to me was the ongoing project documenting women who were redefining what aging could look like. Each portrait session reminded me that the story Ben and I were writing together was part of a larger cultural shift toward recognizing that life after 50 could be a period of continued growth, creativity, and new beginnings, rather than gradual decline and increasing limitation. On a warm spring evening, as Ben and I walked along the Portland waterfront after dinner at our favorite restaurant, I found myself thinking about the wine cellar cooling system that had brought us together. 4 years earlier, what had seemed like an expensive inconvenience at the time had actually been the catalyst for everything good that had happened since. My return to photography, our relationship, the move to Portland, and the life we'd built together based on mutual support, and shared adventures. "Ben," I said, stopping to look out at the river where the setting sun was creating reflections that would have made a beautiful photograph. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if my wine cellar hadn't broken down that day?" Ben smiled and pulled me closer to him. "I think about it sometimes," he said. "But then I remember that it wasn't really about the wine cellar. It was about two people who were ready to take risks and be open to possibilities they hadn't considered before. If it hadn't been the cooling system, it would have been something else. We would have found each other somehow." His confidence in the inevitability of our connection touched me, but I wasn't entirely convinced that timing and circumstance didn't matter. What if I hadn't been ready to trust someone new? What if Ben had been focused only on the technical problem rather than seeing me as a person worth getting to know? What if either of us had been too scared or too cautious to allow friendship to develop into something deeper? "Maybe," I said. "But I'm grateful it happened the way it did. I'm grateful for the broken cooling system and the emergency call and the way you listened when I told you I was 50 and thought it might be too late for love." "It was never too late," Ben replied. "You just needed to meet someone who could see what you had to offer instead of what you thought you were lacking." As we walked home through the Portland neighborhoods we'd come to love, past the coffee shops and galleries and community gardens that had become part of our daily landscape, I reflected on how much my understanding of love and partnership had evolved since my divorce. At 50, I'd thought romance was about finding someone who would accept my limitations and compromises. At 54, I understood that real love was about finding someone who inspired you to exceed your own expectations, while accepting you completely as you were. Ben and I had created something together that was larger and more meaningful than either of us could have built alone. Our marriage was a true partnership, based on equality and mutual respect, and the shared commitment to keep growing as individuals, while building something significant together. The woman who had stood in her Napa Valley kitchen holding a wedding dress and wondering if her chances for happiness were behind her had been asking the wrong question. It wasn't about last chances or missed opportunities. It was about being brave enough to remain open to love when it appeared in unexpected forms, and wise enough to recognize that the best relationships are built not on need or desperation, but on the solid foundation of two complete people choosing to share their adventures. Standing in our Portland loft that night, looking out at the city lights reflecting on the river, surrounded by the photographs and books and comfortable furniture, that represented the life we'd built together. I understood that 53 was exactly the right age to be married to Ben Martinez. Not because we were running out of time, but because we'd both lived long enough to know what we wanted and brave enough to choose it deliberately. The wine cellar had been fixed years ago, but what it had started continued to grow and flourish in ways that neither of us could have predicted. Sometimes the most important repairs are the ones that happen to your faith in possibility, your willingness to risk disappointment for the chance at something extraordinary. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, the repairman who shows up to fix what's broken ends up staying to help you build something entirely new. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out